Now let's take a look on the influence of human activity on changing groundwater. So we've already discussed how human activity can influence some of the differences in the other parts of the hydrological cycle. So let's take a look at the influence on actual groundwater itself. Now, more and more, we tend to increase our agricultural needs around the world, and this leads to an increase in irrigation needs as well. So where do we get this water from? We are actually taking it directly from the groundwater stores, which then reduces those groundwater stores around. So agriculture has developed this scheme, I guess, this idea called center pivot irrigation. Now this is a method of crop irrigation in which the sprinklers will actually move around a center pivot point. Now you might have seen some of these. I see them a lot traveling down I-75 and around the citrus groves and around other places nearby. And what it is the picture on the left, you kind of see this this area, this large-scale contraption, if you will, that irrigates the land and that travels around in a circle. On the right-hand side, you'll actually see an aerial photograph of a whole area of agriculture that is irrigated by the center pivot scheme. Now notice that we have these large areas of green area, which is the agriculture. This is where the crops are being grown. But also notice all the brown areas. Now this is not these are areas that are not being grown right now. There's nothing in those particular areas. So imagine the effects of infiltration on this particular part of the area. So while the agriculture might be in those green areas, the infiltration rates would probably definitely different from those green areas versus those brownish type of areas. So that's another consideration here as well. We're not just taking from groundwater in these areas, we're actually affecting the infiltration rates and the interception rates of this particular area as well. Now, agriculture has allowed us to kind of take away from these groundwater stores. However, we have lots of areas that used to have high industrial activities. So those recent reductions in these industrial areas have led to rises of groundwater levels in certain places because less groundwater is actually being taken out of the ground in these particular places. Now, unfortunately, the rise of the groundwater also has its detriments to a particular area. So it's great these particular the groundwater stores in these areas are rising, but what might be happening is that there's an increase in the spring and river flows around these areas. Perhaps these were already dried up and now they're being used for something else, but unfortunately, with higher levels of groundwater, now these springs and these rivers are coming back. So they're beginning to flow once again. We might see surface water flooding in particular areas because the groundwater is rising enough to sort of reach the ground, or I should say the surface. Now this also might be polluting surface and groundwater areas because of the old pipes and all the sewage pipes that are around. These might be corroding and breaking, and now with the rising the rising groundwaters, it might be taking up all of these corrosion and whatever was sitting inside these pipes and sewage drains and polluting the areas around it. And in the process, also polluting the groundwater that's around it as well. This also might flood basements because now as the water's rising, it has to go somewhere. If it has these cracks in these particular concrete structures, basements might be flooded, and all sorts of other things might happen. A larger list of problems that include the rise of groundwater can be found in your textbook, so please don't discount that particular place in your textbook. It is very, very important to kind of take a look at. Now, something that might be a positive way for groundwater, human activity on groundwater, is a recharging of this groundwater. And this is something that we can do if there is kind of like a 50-50 store. If we are able to use some of the surface stores that we have, and we can actually add it back to the groundwater. And this might be a recharging of the groundwater in certain areas. Again, your textbook describes places in Israel that do this. They have an overabundance of irrigated water that's on the surface. So what they do is take this water and sort of give it back. They create these pumpings or these pits which allow water to seep back into the ground, infiltrate, if you will. So these are just a couple ways to recharge groundwater is by, like I mentioned, the pumping water into pits or wells in these areas of impermeability. So if you have a large area of the concrete jungle, what we can do is pump water into places surrounding this concrete jungle, and that recharges the groundwater in those specific areas. Another thing is called water spreading, and these are in areas of permeability. So if we have large areas of ground that can actually be used and be infiltrated by water, then water spreading is another possible way to recharge the groundwater. This has to occur if and only if we have an abundance of surface waters. If we don't, then chances are we're not going to be able to do these things in order to recharge that groundwater. Now, along the way, we've been talking about how dams affect the hydrological cycle in certain ways. So this is a slide that sort of shows you some of the ways that dams are advantageous and not so advantageous to the way that things work around the world. Now, dams are something that we use to control the water sources, to the rivers, the flow of river. Maybe for irrigation purposes, we build these dams. We want to use the water sources in certain ways. And it's very important for us, sorry about that. It's very important for us sometimes to actually use these groundwater stores or these surface stores in order to do some of the things that humans need water for. So here are some advantages to dams. Now keep in mind these are good things for dams that humans have sort of we've influenced by these dams. So we have flood and drought control. This is something that we use dams for all the time. So we stop up these rivers to stop dams. A lot of the Aswan Dam in the Nile River in Egypt has actually been used to stop river flooding. Now drought control is another. If we have an area that has very little water into a certain area, we can create a dam which allows that water to stay in certain areas so they can use it. Irrigation purposes, this is probably one of the largest reasons for dams. Improved navigation. Think of the lock system that's through the Panama Canal. These are basically a series of dams that allows ships to go from the Atlantic Ocean to the Pacific Ocean. And recreation and tourism. I mean, these can be used for purposes for travel as well. They can be beautified, and they can make places beautified as well. So you can come and visit, and these are big lakes, like the Hoover Dam is something that people do go and visit. Now there are disadvantages to dams as well. Now we have tons of water loss, and in specific areas where the dam stops the water, it does not allow the water to flow past that dam. Or it does, but it's actually something that we control. So we control the amount of water through here. Groundwater changes. Now this changes a lot of the groundwater stores because now the natural flow of this river is not being allowed to happen. So it changes that groundwater flow, changes the through flow, changes a lot of those stores that are found underground. Drowning of archaeological sites. This is a huge one. And when China was building their dam, this actually occurred where once the dam was created, it would drown out entire areas of archaeological history. Now this is something of a problem, especially for the history of humans and the history of certain countries or certain areas. A lot of people do not like this fact. And there are several, especially in the Nile River was one of them when the Aswan Dam was being built. There's tons of stories about how archaeological sites were drowned because of those dams being built. It's a huge waste of history. Deposition within the lake. There's a different resource, a different source of water that's happening when we put dams up. We're changing the way that the hydrology works in certain areas. So we get a lot of deposition or erosions of deltas that naturally would not happen. Decreased fish catches. Now, if we're stopping water, we're also stopping the natural flow of fish from one side to the other. So fish catches in certain areas will also be affected. Salinization. This is something I touched on in another video. As evaporation happens, it might happen much quicker because now we have a lot of water here. And as water evaporates quickly, it might leave behind some of the salts from that water. Too much salt will eventually infiltrate back into the groundwater and it will affect the groundwater in a negative way. Displacement of populations. Building dams, remember, floods certain areas because now we're stopping the natural flow of rivers. So you're actually moving huge populations sometimes with building of dams. Channel erosion beneath the channel. We're changing, again, we're changing the morphology or the way that the river is going to look. So erosion is going to change. Seismic stress. There's been a lot of discussion about dams in China that actually are causing earthquakes in China. So this is something that's a big problem as well, because now we have all of these natural stores of water with large pumps being used, and this is a possible seismic stress on this particular part of the country. Loss of nutrients, again, because that natural flow is not happening, some important nutrients are not reaching the other side of the dam. And spread of disease. So think about also what we're doing in this particular part when we're building up these dams. We might be spreading different kinds of diseases as the water either flows through what we want it to flow through, or it might be using this particular area to spread to other populations. Now again, your textbook has many more advantages and disadvantages. These are some of the most important ones in my mind. So take a look at your textbook to also see some of the ones that they discuss in there.